So I think we can start now. So, hello everybody, dear Cornelia, dear Thomas, dear Nikolaus Wolf, dear Charlotte Bartels, dear friends and colleagues, dear students. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce this panel discussion, The World of Tomorrow, Inequality and Participation Challenges of Today's Economic Policy, that we are co-organizing in the context of the 30th anniversary of the Centre Marc Bloch, together with Cornelia and the Hertie School, around the latest book of yours, Thomas, A Short History of Inequality, eine kurze Geschichte der Ungleichheit, that has just come out in the German version at CH Beck Publishers this fall. For us at the Centre Marc Bloch, it is the second time that you give us the honor to discuss one of your new books on a panel with other colleagues. And I remember very well the bizarre circumstances of March 2020, when we had to change plans in the very last moment because of the mounting figures of the pandemic, which for all of us was at this moment still unknown and a bit frightening. Instead of a bigger public event, we ended up with a small internal research seminar with our researchers of the Centre and only some outside guests on the podium with you. Among them, Henrik Enderlein, your predecessor, dear Cornelia, who has passed away so suddenly a couple of months later, which was a real shock for us all. I wanted to use this moment to recall him and his important work and the last discussions that we had together at the Centre. Indeed, we both said at this occasion that once the pandemic behind us, we should come together and discuss possible teams and formats of collaboration between the Hertie School and the Centre Marc Bloch. This is why I'm so happy that we can have this event today here with all of you at the Hertie School in remembrance also of this extraordinary Franco-German political economist. I leave it to Cornelia to introduce the topic of today's discussion and to present the speakers of the podium. I just want to underline how important the topic of today has been for the Centre Marc Bloch in the last 30 years, but certainly more from a sociological, historical, philosophical, or political science perspective. A lot of research has been done at the Centre Marc Bloch on labor relations, gender relations, political mobilizations, and other topics that also imply the question of inequalities and mobilization. But this is precisely why our debate of today seems so important for us, as it will open up the discussion to the more economic dimensions of inequality and participation. And it's this kind of interdisciplinary debate that we try to promote at the Centre Marc Bloch. So we are very happy to have found with you, Thomas, but also with Charlotte Bartels, Nikolaus Wolf, open-minded economists that are willing to engage in this discourse. This is unfortunately not so common, but it is so important. And we thank all of you for it, also naturally Cornelia as our host and moderator of this evening. But before giving over the word to you, Cornelia, let me just thank also all the people involved at the Centre Marc Bloch and at the Hertie School for the perfect organization of this event, namely Sebastian Vanier and Benjamin Stappenbeck and their crews. So thank you once more. I wish you all and myself a very interesting evening and an interesting debate.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, dear guests, first of all, let me thank Professor Vogel for the welcoming remarks and for allowing the Hertie School to participate in this event and to cooperate with the Centre Marc Bloch, because for me it's our way, it's the Hertie School's way of wishing the Centre Marc Bloch a very happy 30th birthday and to send along our good wishes for a successful development for the next 30 years of your important work on Franco-German research collaboration. And I'm also very touched to be able to host Thomas Piketty for this event here at the Hertie School, because Thomas, I believe the last time I was sitting on a panel with you was in Paris together with Henrik Enderlein. So we were sitting left and right to you. So it's for me, it's a wonderful occasion to continue this discussion now from Berlin. So I'm absolutely delighted that you have accepted to come and speak to us today, Thomas. And I will start by saying that you have influenced academic and political discussion, not just in France and Germany, but truly around the world. Thomas Piketty does not need an introduction, but I have the honor to do one anyway. And so I will mention that he is professor at the Paris School of Economics, one of the most renowned places for economic research in France, which he co-founded in 2005. So the Paris School of Economics has, together with the Hertie School, an upcoming 20th anniversary in the coming semesters. I will also point out that Thomas Piketty is a research director at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, EHESS. And without dragging the audience into the institutional history of France, you should know that the EHESS is a prestigious social science university built in the post-war period by scholars such as Claude Lévi-Strauss, Fernand Braudel, and later also who hosted Pierre Bourdieu. And Thomas has written in the preface of Capital in the 21st Century, I believe it was, that he spent a lot of time in his younger years studying the massive books produced at the EHESS by scholars who were very interested in the longue durée history of the world, and that it left a mark on him, and that was quite a frustrating experience for him to do economics without this broad perspective. And so I think you can see in the scholar that he has become these seemingly incompatible traditions, which on the one hand is the ambition of modern day economics to provide very rigorous data, and on the other hand, the social science ambition to provide a very deep understanding and a thick description of historical social sciences. And I think we see in his work that he is trying to do exactly that, to tackle the really big questions. And that he is doing so by both looking at the broad strokes and by collecting and cleaning data to make his analysis on the most accurate and innovative databases. And we'll discuss much of this today. His work on inequality builds on such a data gathering effort with many collaborators around the world that comes together in the World Inequality Lab and the World Inequality Database, which he co-directs. Now, all of these formal affiliations do not summarize well the importance of Thomas' work in bringing economic inequality, its material development, its ideological justification, and the political dynamics keeping it in place back into the public debate during the last decade. So let me point the neophyte who might be in the room to the conclusion of Waltraud Schelkle that is cited on the back of the German version of the book we are presenting today. And she quite simply summarized Thomas' impact in a recent article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung with the sentence, "Thomas Piketty is turning into the Karl Marx of the 21st century." Now, I like the Franco-German aspect of that comparison, Thomas, and I always point out that Karl Marx has achieved the pinnacles of academic achievement that a scholar can reach. We cite Karl Marx without ever mentioning his name, and everybody gets the reference. When you say workers of the world unite, or you speak about the Lumpenproletariat, there is no necessity to add a footnote. And it is true that today, when we speak of economic inequality or the 99%, or 0.01%, we pretty much feel that everybody in the room knows what work this is referring to, and that the audience will have read, possibly not all, but at least a portion of Thomas' work. And Thomas, I do not know if you're aware, but Karl Marx has another claim to fame. He is also the mascot with the appropriate costume, cheering for the basketball team, the Chemnitz 99ers. Chemnitz is a city formerly called Karl-Marx-Stadt in the GDR of Germany, and maybe this is a bright idea that we can discuss sometime for the future. But for now, I will concentrate on the summary of your work that you have produced with this book, because really the admirable ambition of A Brief History of Inequality is to help you avoid reading the very large works that Thomas has written in the past, and there's at least 3 that add up to 3,000 pages altogether. You can see them in the top left corner of Thomas. You see the back, so you just get a sense that this small back binder is really an effort in synthesis and clarity. And Thomas, we thank you for this effort. And we're delighted to have 2 experts that will discuss your findings and probe some of your conclusions and open questions. So next to me, we have Dr. Charlotte Bartels, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the German Institute for Economic Research, the DIW, who we're proud to call our neighbor. So you just point in this direction of the building and you would be almost there. And Charlotte Bartels has worked intensively on the data we will see here today, also as the contributor to the German series in the World Inequality Database. But she has a lot of other, what does one say, cords to her arc, if that's the right translation. She's previously worked at the Center for European Studies at Harvard University, where she served as a Kennedy Fellow during the academic year 21 and 22. And before that, she was a visiting associate professor at City University of New York in 2020. Dr. Bartels received her PhD in economics from the Free University in Berlin. Her research focuses on income and wealth distribution and redistribution in the fields of empirical public and labor economics and economic history. And she is currently working on building a database that combines and extends inequality data in Germany called the German Regional Inequality Database, GRID. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bartels. On my right-hand side, Professor Dr. Nikolaus Wolf is Professor of Economics and Economic History at Humboldt University since 2010. After a career at the University of Warwick, Free University Berlin, and affiliations at Oxford University, the University Pompeu Fabra, and the London School of Economics. In 2003, he received his PhD in Economic History from Humboldt University. As a data-driven economic historian, Professor Wolf works on the economic development in Europe since the beginning of the 20th century with great attention to inequality and regional development, macro-historical trends and the impact of economic development and relations between countries on identity and conflict. Many thanks for joining the discussion today, Professor Wolf. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Thomas Piketty to present his work and then guide you through the discussion with our panelists. Thomas, the floor and the screen is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot, Cornelia. Thanks a lot, Jacob, and everybody for organizing this. So, yeah, I would love to be in Berlin. Do have a strong, long-run movement toward more equality, more political equality, more economic equality, social equality. This is a process that is much deeper than simply, sometimes people have summarized some of my previous findings by saying, okay, you have World War I, World War II, this reduces inequality with a lot of, catastrophic events, and basically that's it. And without such catastrophic event, nothing can happen, etc. And I really don't like this pessimistic view of the world, because I think it is simply not true. I think the movement toward more equality, was certainly accelerated in some complex ways by World War I and World War II, which also produced all sorts of horrible things, obviously in their own right, including politically, obviously. But the movement toward equality is much deeper than that, and it started much before World War I. It continued much after World War II. And, it starts, the historical movement I have in mind is a movement which begins very much at the end of the 18th century, typically with the French Revolution and the abolition of the privileges of the aristocracy, which
sets the beginning of the end of societies based on privileges on the one hand. And the second major event at the end of the 18th century is the slave revolt in Saint-Domingue, which sets the beginning of the end of slave and colonial societies. Now, if we take these two joint movements, you can see that this process of, going toward more equality is not over, so it has continued. It has continued in the 19th century with the abolition of slavery, the beginning of the social movement in Europe, in particular, the rise of universal male suffrage in the 19th century, and the rise of universal female suffrage in the 20th century, the decolonisation movement, the rise of social security, the rise of progressive taxation, civic rights in the US, the end of apartheid. And it has continued in recent decades with, if we think more recently of the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter movement. And so, I think this general movement toward more equality is something that is very deep and that has come together with the rise of modernity and the rise of prosperity. And that's the important point I want to stress. In the long run, this movement toward more equality, has been absolutely central also for the rise of modern economic prosperity. And so the bottom line, it's never been easy. It's always been a complicated political fight, involving huge political mobilization, social struggles, in some cases, revolutionary processes. But in the end, it has worked pretty well. It has been an enormous success historically. And, I think it's important to look at this historical step and to be clear about this historical narrative, if we want to move further in this direction, because I think, we can and we should move further in this direction. So in this short presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a very quick world tour of inequality today and summarize, some of the main ideas from the book. But, let me try to be as brief as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of results from the World Inequality Report 22, which we published a few months ago at the World Inequality Lab. So, the World Inequality Lab relies on a very large network of researchers who have contributed to the World Inequality database. So thank you, Charlotte, for your very important contribution for the German side of the database. But, more generally, we have over 100 researchers from all over the world who have been contributed to this database. So this is a very collective research program. So we started with the study of income inequality, and then we have moved toward looking more at wealth inequality, and more recently at gender inequality and environmental inequality, in particular through the inequality in carbon emission. And so I'm going to give you a very quick snapshot of some of the recent findings in these three areas and illustrate, how this fits with the general message of my latest book, A Brief History of Equality. So let me start with inequality of income, which is the dimension of inequality we started with nearly 20 years ago, or more than 15 years ago. So here you have a very simple indicator, which is the share of total income going to the top 10%. So just to get the orders of magnitude right, we are talking about 10% of the population. So if we had complete equality, they should have 10% of total income. If we had complete inequality, they should have 100%. So of course, it's always between 10 and 100. In practice, it goes, almost from 20 to 70, or well, say 25, 30%, in the most equal country, which would be Sweden or Norway today. It was maybe 20-25% in Sweden in the 1980s. And the highest inequality country will be South Africa with almost 70%. Okay, so it doesn't go from 10 to 100, but it goes from almost 20 to 70. So first lesson, you have huge variation in levels of inequality across the world. Second observation, this variation have a lot to do with very deep historical legacy of inequality. So if you take South Africa, I don't need to explain, but if you take Latin America also, there's a very particular legacy with inequality. India, Saudi Arabia and the Middle East with the concentration of oil resources also is it's a different mechanism. So, you have different stories for extreme inequality in the world today. It's a mixture of sort of ancient, sometimes pretty archaic, if you want, mechanism and sort of more modern, capitalist-driven inequality mechanism. But the general picture is one of a very large variation in levels of inequality. This is true for the top 10%. This is also true, and maybe even more important, if you look at the share going to the bottom 50%. So again, let's get the orders of magnitude correct. We are talking about 50% of the population. So if we had complete equalities, they should have 50% of income. Complete inequalities, they should have 0%. In practice, it goes from, say, 5 to 25. So, the most unequal country, again, will be South Africa with about 5% of total income for the bottom 50, and the most equal, in Nordic countries in Europe will be almost 25% of total income for the bottom 50. So if you are 50% of the population, you have 25% of total income. It means that your average income is about half of the average income of the entire population. So, of course, you're poorer than average. After all, you are the bottom 50%, but, you are not hugely poorer than average. When you have only 5% of total income, like in South Africa, it means your average income is only about 1/10 of average income of the total population. So you have a much bigger gap. This also means that, if you're interested in poverty, you really need to look at the distribution. So because if you only look at GDP per capita average income, you can see that, because the bottom 50% share varies by a factor of 1 to 5, it means that for a given average income in your country, for a given GDP per capita in your country, the average income of the bottom 50% can actually vary from a factor of 1 to 5 with enormous consequences on sort of basic material deprivation and poverty. So, we need to look at the distribution. The other message here I want to stress is a very large variation across the world, but by and large, if you look here, for instance, the top 10% share, the rich country, in the northern part of the world, tend to be more equal. So that's true for Europe, but it's also true, even the US are sort of more equal than Latin America, or even Japan or China, are more equal than India. So, by and large, richer countries are more equal. Now, the important point is that they have not always been more equal. In fact, they have become more equal, and this is also what has allowed them to become richer. So that's a very important message, is that if you look at Europe, Europe back in 1910 was extremely unequal, and it was not like South Africa today, but it was close to Latin America. If you look at the top 10% share, it will be, 55%, 50%, 60%, depending on the country, and the bottom 50% share was maybe 10%. So you had a level of inequality that was much larger, and it is through, the expansion of the welfare state, more massive and equal investment in education, rise of progressive taxation, that inequality was reduced, and also more prosperity was achieved, particularly in the post-World War II decade. So this is not frozen, this is grounded in history, and this is absolutely central for development in general. Now, let me move to the three other dimensions of inequality that, I want to present, and, then I will stop there so that we have time for discussion. First, other dimension I want to mention is the distribution of wealth. Now, you can see here on this chart that, the main result here is that you have pretty extreme concentration of wealth and capital ownership pretty much everywhere. So, Europe, again, looks a bit more equal than the rest of the world, but, the bottom 50% in Europe owns, about 4% of total wealth. Now that's better than, in Latin America, it will be 1%. In the US, it will be 2%. So, okay, 4% is better. That's for sure. But, for 50% of the population, this is really very small. And this is true in Europe in general, but it's also true in France. This is true in Germany. This is typically what Charlotte has found for Germany. And in fact, this has deteriorated in the recent, in the past 20 years in Germany. But, generally speaking, there's been relatively little progress regarding the distribution of wealth, at least from the point of view of the bottom 50%. There's been some substantial progress for this group, which I call here the middle 40%, which in fact is not really in the middle. It's more the upper middle class, if you want. This is the group that is in between the bottom 50% and the top 10. And you can see that this group in Europe now has close to 40% of total wealth. So, if you are 40% of the population, you have 40% of total wealth. It means on average, you have roughly average wealth, which would be, say, about 200,000 euros per adult today in France and close to this in Germany. So this will be people who have 100,000 euros, 200, 300, 400 per adult. So these are people who are not millionaire, or they're not billionaire, of course, but they are not completely poor. They are a very important group, and the rise of this middle class and the fact that this middle 40% group now has a substantial share of total wealth is an enormous historical transformation. And 1 century ago, they would have little more than 10%, say, of total wealth, so they will be not very different from the bottom 50%. So this is a very important transformation. But from the point of view of the bottom 50%, there was not much progress. So the question is, how can we make further progress? And what I argue in a brief history of equality is that, well, first we have to better understand, how we made the progress that happened. And, I talk about the rise of the welfare state, but also the rise of progressive taxation. But at the same time, we have to realize that, this has not been sufficient to spread the wealth more equally. And if we want to go further, we have to think about something else. We cannot just say, let's wait for growth and, market competition, because we've had growth for 200 years and which creates other problems, of course, today. And, in any case, we are not going to wait another 200 years. Probably this will not make a big difference for the bottom 50% wealth share. So the kind of solution that I discuss in the book are typically the redistribution of inheritance. I think if you don't have something like a minimum inheritance for everybody at age 25, and it cannot be 5% or 10% of average wealth, 5,000 euro or 10,000 euro. It has to be at least 50%, 60% of average wealth, say 100,000 euro, 120,000 euro. It's like for basic income. If you propose a basic income equal to 100 euros per month in 10% of average income or 5% of average income, this is really a bit ridiculous. So, it has to be more, 50% of average or something substantial. And, I make some proposal about that in the book. I'm not saying this is going to happen next week, but I'm just saying, if we don't have something like this, then we will probably continue with a very concentrated distribution of wealth. And let me argue that, this is more than a matter about money. This is really about power and about, about how much you have a bargaining power about your own life, basically. So, when you own zero, you cannot, you have to accept basically everything you are proposed. You have to take almost any job, any working condition, any wage, because, you have to pay for your rent, you have to feed your family. If you own 100,000 euros, 200,000 euros, in addition to the system of basic safety net, basic income, etc., then, this gives you more power, vis-a-vis the rest of society and over your own life. You can buy a home, you can create a firm, you can wait a little bit before taking any job. And, I think this more equal distribution of social and economic power in society will be very beneficial to the entire society. So that's why, I think wealth inequality is so important. Now let me come to, another dimension, very important dimension of inequality, which we now try to cover in the World Inequality Database, which is gender inequality. So here we have this very simple indicator. So we have other indicators as well, but I want to focus on this one now, which is simply the share of women in the total labor income, total wage bill, but also total self-employment labor income. And the bottom line is that we are, if you take this indicator, we are pretty far from gender parity. We are pretty far from 50%, which, if you take all studies on time use survey, women actually supply more than 50% of total working time if you include domestic labor. So, this could be a reasonable target. Now we are very far from that. So if you look in Western Europe, we have moved up from, about 30% to a bit more than 35 today. It will be maybe 37 or 38% in a country like France, and I guess in Germany it must be not very different. Which means that, men are still getting 63 or 62% of total labor income. And I think this way of presenting the reality in a way is more relevant than when we just look at gender gap for a given occupation. Because the thing is that, women don't have access to the same high earning occupation as men for all sorts of reasons. And, I think looking at this indicator in a way is more meaningful. You can also see that, it's very small in the Middle East and North Africa, in the MENA region, 15%. Now, if you take France in 1970, it was about 20%, 22%. So, which was sort of the golden age of sort of patriarchal society in the Western style patriarchal society with the breadwinner model, where basically women were just excluded, almost completely excluded from monetary matters and monetary income and monetary power, with almost 80% of total income going to men. There's been some substantial change since then, but we're still very far. There are some countries like China where this is actually going down. This is because you have sort of the breadwinner model is also putting pressure on Chinese women to not to work as much as men, and Chinese women don't have access to the very high earning occupation. Look at a picture of the Chinese Communist Party central meeting, or top CEO of Chinese firms. They don't have access to this high earning occupation, and because the share of high earning jobs has increased in the total wage bill, this also contributes to increase the share of men in total labor income. Basically, when the top 1% share is increasing, because you have mostly men in the top 1%, it also means that the share of men is increasing. So in the West, this is counterbalanced by other factors, but in China, which was starting from a relatively higher level like Russia, like other communist parties like East Germany relative to West Germany, but still, this has been going down. And let me conclude with this last slide, which is, maybe the most important for the future, which is about the inequality in carbon emission across the world and within countries. So, when we talk about inequality in carbon emission, we very often talk about the North-South divide, the fact that the North has is responsible for the biggest part of historical accumulated emission, and the South is going to suffer from the consequences. And of course, this is completely true. But it is also important to stress that there is huge inequality within the South and within the North. So if you take Europe, again, the average emission of the bottom 50% of the population with the lowest emission is about 5.1 right now, which is, this is still too much. This has to go toward 4 or 3 or 2 in the coming decades, but it is not completely off the mark as compared to where we need to go. The problem is that, the top 10% has 29. And if you were to look at North America, the top 10% has 73. Now, if you were to look at the top 1% in Europe, it would be 100 or 110. So, you have enormous inequality in this level of carbon emission. And the bottom line is, I don't think we are going to be able to reduce carbon emission as drastically as we should if we don't reduce inequality at the same time. The idea that we can address this challenge by some kind of broad, proportional solution with a, big flat carbon tax or a big, across the board increase in energy prices so that everybody reduce their energy consumption and carbon emission in a proportional manner is simply not going to work, because I think people in the bottom 50% group, are going to tell you, look, I'm ready to make some effort, but you first need to ask, people, at the top to reduce their emission drastically. And so we need to invent some form of progressive carbon taxation. I'm not saying it's simple, but, people 1 century ago were already saying, progressive income tax is too complicated, we cannot do it. And, in the end, we found ways to do it. And I think today, with carbon emission, we need to invent ways that treat differently people who have an emission of 5 tons, people who have an emission of 30 or 50 tons. And, I'm very concerned when I hear the European Union project for the future, about extending the market for carbon emission, or, increasing carbon taxation. It's always, sort of very flat tax kind of solution. You completely forget about social classes and about inequality. And we've had the yellow vest movement in France, but I think we'll have gigantic yellow vest movement everywhere if we don't take inequality more seriously. Let me stop there so that we have time for discussion. Sorry if I was already a bit too long, and thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Very much, Thomas, for this overview and snapshot of a lot of data that we know is more voluminous, and even in terms of slides, I think this is the shortest presentation I've ever seen you present. So we appreciate the synthesis, and it allows me to give the word to our panel to go a bit further in some of the issues that are also in the book. And I will start by turning to Charlotte Bartels and to ask her about something you don't see when you look at the 21 data, and that is the long-term development of equality and inequalities. And I'd like to ask you what to you are the mechanisms that are important in driving these long-term developments, and maybe, because you know Thomas' work well, are there arguments that he puts forth that you disagree with, or if you agree on everything, you can also just say that.
Yeah, so let me first, should I turn it on? It's okay. So let me first say that I of course, I'm very much inspired by Thomas' hypothesis and work from the beginning of my postdoc studies, when he gave a talk at the Freie University when I just handed in my PhD. So very much of my recent work has been on studying in more detail the mechanisms that he suggested. And let me comment on 3 mechanisms that my research has highlighted in the past few years, which is capital gains, growth, and inheritances. So Thilo Albers is also here, who worked on with me and Moritz Schulerich on the long-run series in wealth concentration in Germany. And surprisingly, we found that in the long run, Germany's wealth inequality looks very much like any other country that has been studied so far, which was kind of disappointing in first glance, because we thought it would limit our publication possibilities, because we don't have a German Sonderweg. But then when we discussed about it and studied what happens in more detail, we unpack a lot of mechanisms that happened during World War I, hyperinflation, Great Depression, and World War II. And we found that actually, wealth inequality is very much shaped by international co-movements. So capital gains or asset prices move together in a lot of developed countries. So when people who own houses get richer, they tend to get richer in the US and in Germany in similar decades. And also we found that taxation is handled very similarly across countries. So wealth taxation, progressive income taxation was introduced more or less in the same periods across countries. So in Germany, we have this massive wealth taxation after World War II, which massively redistributed wealth across the population, which is a nice laboratory, we think, to study the large impact that the one-off wealth levy can have on wealth concentration in the long run. So let me say this regarding to the high importance of capital gains and the co-movement of taxation and asset prices that we find over the long run across industrial countries. Then in another study, which is also speaking to one of Thomas' earlier models from 2011, we study the connection between economic growth and inheritances. And we find that in Germany, first of all, let me say, so we have seen a decline in economic growth in many countries across the world. So economic growth has declined from an average of about 4% to less than 2% over the past few decades, which limits the possibilities for people who rely on labor income to save. So we find that it matters very much that is owned in Germany. So finally, inheritances. We also have a study where we study a nice setting that existed in Germany at the turn of the century, where land was divided equally between siblings in some areas of Germany, and in others it was granted to the firstborn son. And we find that in the first round during industrialization, this turned out to be beneficial for growth because it stimulated more entrepreneurship in those areas where wealth was equally divided among siblings. But apparently over the long run, given that we don't really tax high entrepreneurial wealth in Germany after World War II, this contributed to a higher wealth concentration and higher income concentration at the top in these regions today. So I think it's interesting to highlight generally that these mechanisms may change over time and may also change with the institutions that are developed over time. So we have to do a very careful analysis how institutions, and which are of course part of the mechanisms, play with each other.
Thank you very much. Thomas, if you agree, I will not give you the floor back immediately. I will turn to my right. I will then see if you would like to comment on it. And then my two panelists can get a second question each before we open to questions in the room, because I understand that we stop at 7:30. And so however I need to manage the time means I'll see when I give the floor back to you. But we will have you come back in. Before I do so, thank you very much to Charlotte Bartels for this overview of mechanisms. And let me turn to Nikolaus Woll for a political question, and in particular, the outcome that is the desired outcome at the end of this book. In particular, Thomas pleads for a democratic, ecologically conscious, and culturally diverse socialism, and criticizes, this is my words, not his, liberal social democracy a bit as a sellout to capitalist forces. And so I would like to turn to you and ask you, do you agree with the political account that comes in the end, and if not, why?
Yes, thank you. So I really agree with most of what Thomas is writing, particularly in this summary book here. But I am in fact critical about this perspective of that we sort of ought to think rather about the competition between various socialisms, as you put it, towards the end, right, Thomas? I think there is reasons to believe that especially the successes, right, that you have described over the 19th century, the 20th century, I would rather argue that they are, the successes of socialists turning social democrat. At the risk of fighting over definitions here, of course, I'd say what was particularly important was actually the activity of trade unions, of strikes, right? And at the time, Edward Bernstein called trade unions the democratic element within the capitalist system, right? Also, again, after the Second World War, right? When we see this was intriguingly, this was the heyday of both super high growth rates and a decline of inequality. This was, of course, due to kind of happy circumstances by hindsight, but also because of a really active trade unions, I'd say, right? And social democratic programs towards more progressive taxation and so on and so forth. I think maybe it's been blurred a little bit because of this, the narrative that, the world after 1945 was a world divided into kind of the Soviet bloc and the capitalist Western bloc, and then actually in these narratives there is this stressing of all the capitalist characteristics of this Western world. But if you look closely, you realize that there was a very high, of course, tax level around during the super growth years. There were actually lots of regulation. Real estate markets, land markets were very much regulated still. And apparently this was not too harmful at all, right? So I would say, apparently there is a form of capitalism, right? Maybe kind of a social democratic version of capitalism that seems to do the trick potentially, right? So I wouldn't envision really kind of that we need to go towards more socialism. That's not really a vision I'd share. But this comes at the risk of kind of fighting over definitions. What exactly we mean. Final thing, I think the Blair-Schröder third way was probably a dead end, right? So this was kind of when social democrats turned wrong, right? But I think the bulk of social democracy in Europe, at least, would agree that this time's over.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Let me see if you'd like to come in and comment on possibly not all, but some of the things you've heard.
Yeah. Yes, I think I have to comment here and enter the discussion. Okay, when I talk about socialism and about participatory socialism and multicultural ecological socialism for the 21st century, if you want to call it social democracy for the 21st century, I have absolutely no problem with this choice of word. The problem is the content. The problem is, do we look at social democracy as something that is frozen, that has already achieved its full potential, or do we look at it as something that is dynamic? You just said that most social democratic leaders in Europe today would accept that Blair-Schröder was a dead end. This is a good news. I'm not sure this is completely true, but let's take this statement as and let's assume this is indeed the common viewpoint. But the question is, if you consider this was a dead end, what's the new target in the long run? And I think it's important to think again about the long run. And so, to be very concrete, I think there are many great achievements of social democratic institutions in the 20th century, and we need to keep them and to be very positive about them, and we need to teach and learn how they were made possible. The role of trade union was absolutely critical. So I'm very clear about this. But then we also need to think about the next step and what the currently existing social democratic institution, the mix of welfare state, progressive taxation, workers' rights, union power, what was not sufficient. And so I insisted in my presentation about the distribution of wealth. And I think, that's one important component in which relatively little progress has been made. Well, some progress has been made, as I say, for this sort of middle 40%, between the bottom 50% and the top 10. But for the majority of the population, access to wealth and property still remains almost impossible, and especially in times with low growth for the reasons that Charlotte mentioned. And so the question is, what do we do about that? And if we just stick to the social democratic institutions that were put in place in the 20th century, that's not going to be enough. At least if we do that, then it means we believe we cannot do better than the kind of distribution of wealth we have today, with the bottom 50% as, less than 5% of the total. And I think we can do better. And, of course, there are other ways to have more power sharing in societies through more workers' rights in the board of corporations, but you also know that co-determination is not sufficient to solve all problems. We can move further in this direction. I make proposal about extending co-determination to smaller companies or to limit the fraction of voting rights that a single shareholder could have within the 50% of the seats going to shareholders. And, I think that's very important, but, I don't think this will be sufficient. I think you also need to think about the redistribution of wealth itself. Now, we can call it social democracy for the 21st century. If you don't like to talk about socialism, I have no problem with this. But we need to take seriously the idea that, social democracy is not a finished product. This is not a finished product, like the European Union, of course, is not a finished product. And we need to think about the next step, in 50 years, 60 years. And in the end, what I am proposing is, of course, it's different from the social democratic institution of today. But I would say, this is not more different from the social democratic institution of today than the social democratic system of today is different from the capitalism of 1910, 100 years ago. So this is in the continuation, but this is equally ambitious in terms of transformation for the future as what happened in the past. And sometime in this discussion where, we don't want socialism, we are very happy with social democracy, I hear something like, okay, let's stop exactly where we are. We have found the perfect compromise. Social democratic capitalism, we have to stop there. But I think this kind of defensive attitude, let's stop exactly where we are, is not really satisfactory, especially in the political world where you have lots of people who want to change the world in sort of lots of ugly manners. If all we have to say, we want to stick to what we have, I'm not sure this is going to make it.
So I sense that you'd like to answer to that, but I would say hold it. You will get the floor back when I ask you my second question, and you can then answer to this. I would like to use the response Thomas just gave to dig in a bit more and find out about these social democratic institutions, and in particular on the success and failure of redistribution that you observe in your studies. I'd like to talk about welfare states and taxation as tools for redistribution, and ask Charlotte Bartels, why and when have they been successful and what have they failed to do in the past? From your research, can you tell us whether they're the right tools or what we are seemingly not able to do with them that are below the hopes that we might have had at one point?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So I think it's very important to look at both how to tax and get revenue for the government to redistribute, and then also how we spend it. And in one study that I have where we have a large cross-country comparison, we look at actually how redistributive different welfare states are if we look at an annual perspective or on a long-run perspective. And we find that the demographic composition of countries actually matters very much, how much they redistribute over the life cycle. So Germany, for example, appears to be very redistributive in a first glance if we just look at how much GDP is reduced from gross income to net income. But if we look into this in more detail, we see that this is very much due to the large pension contributions that we annually pay, and that pensioners receive back when they retire. And the share of pensioners is growing. So I think this is also that particularly young people should be aware of, and maybe also enter the debate on this, how much politicians ever increase the pensions that we pay to the high increasing share of old-aged people in our country and how much they actually invest in future generations like ours or the generations that are yet to come. So I think particularly in a country like Germany with the aging population, much more than in the US, a lot of money is redistributed from my young pocket to my old pocket and not really redistributed across people. So to compensate for earnings differences on the labor market. So we're not really doing a very good job on this if we take this perspective. And also, it's always nice to talk about raising taxes, raising inheritance taxation, but I feel that this is also something where journalists very quickly stop to investigate more deeply because of this very powerful lobby of German family firms that is very successful in shutting down the discussion very quickly. So I think on a general note, it's so important what Thomas' project has already achieved to just inform the popular debate, the public debate about the numbers of wealth concentration across the world and in a country like Germany, so that also without any ideology, people know what we could theoretically distribute and what equality-enhancing achievement we could get.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Nikolaus Wolf and give you the chance to answer to the debate on socialism versus social democracy, but add a second question, and that has to do with regional inequalities, which you've studied at length. I would be interested to see how much of the inequalities we see here, which are between different income groups, also can be declined is not the word, separated out according to regional inequalities, which are important, and this is the political scientist speaking, because regional inequalities will also affect political cleavage lines. And of course, we are very interested in the mechanisms that translate from socioeconomic inequalities to political inequalities to political conflict, which then perpetuates or is likely to overturn the development in inequality over the long term. So can you speak to regional and spatial aspects of inequalities and answer Thomas' previous comment?
Yes, thank you so much. Let's start with the regional aspects. So I think that there is a striking similarity in dynamics. What Thomas has highlighted time and again is that that there is a kind of a turning point around 1980, right? That actually inequalities tended to increase again around 1980, income, also wealth. But then if you look at the regional dimension, you see something very similar, and it's not obvious why this is so similar. You see that actually there was this big period of convergence where actually lagging regions in Europe, in the United States, in other parts of the world actually were catching up to the leaders. And this was driven by a couple of things, but whatever was driving that, it came to an end around 1980, and it turned around actually. So you see actually that regions were falling behind. Now this is important to explore in more detail. We have already mentioned, Charlotte has mentioned real estate markets that are of course a very important factor behind wealth inequalities. And if you think about it, it must be related to kind of the spatial concentration of economic activity. What also happened in around 1980 is that you see the kind of something that was already underway, but becomes really visible, is the deindustrialization of parts of the Western world, and the rise of some big cities to global hubs of kind of service providers. And these cities are still doing very, very well, and they are attracting skilled workers, and they are still also kind of fueling all this this old narrative of everybody can make it by kind of coming to the city. But it's really coming at the expense of some people falling behind, and this is so important because you have people that apparently cannot move or are unwilling to move, and it's really a question whether anybody should kind of force them to move, right? There is this some economists say, well, we should never really do place-based policies. We should do people-based policies. Why care about a region, right? We should care about people. But then, I mean, if you realize that there are people who apparently have really difficulties to kind of move, then, you know, becoming a very problematic position. And of course, there's this political aspect that as long as our democracies are organized, you know, by territorial constituencies, right? You know, we have to and should care about all these places that are left behind. So this is, I think, an important dimension of this that should be maybe researched more.
Socialism?
Socialism, social democracy. Well, yes, no, I'm up. You know, now again, I agree with what Thomas said towards the end of his response, because clearly it's not by no means good enough to stick to where we are, right? Maybe social democracy has to reinvent itself and, you know, think, okay, what apparently worked some 40 years ago in terms of much higher capital taxation might be a good idea again. But of course, that's, you know, you also need really new approaches. One thing might be the introduction of minimum wages that could be a substitute for the missing trade unions in some parts of the world. Generally, the introduction of standards that have a supranational reach, right? So it's kind of regulations that really are binding beyond the nation state, because a part of the problem and part of the reason why we cannot go back to where we have been in 1950 is that you know, generally national regulations are just not good enough anymore, right? So we need to have, you know, standards that are binding at least a European level, or if possible a global, right? And that's the big challenge. How can we kind of be really have some sort of a globalization of social democracy?
So we have a big plan. Thomas, would you like to comment on some of the things that have been said?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, just following up exactly on this, you know, I think one of the major failures of social democracies beginning in the 1980s, 1990s is the failure to have a more global platform. So typically in the context of Europe, you know, I think free capital flow without any you know, common taxation of capital, and even any exchange of information about who owns what. And, you know, we had to wait until the 2008 financial crisis for the OECD to start talking about automatic exchange of information about who owns what. And this is still not really in place, because the hard law, the hard treaties, which we still live on, you know, the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, basically open up, you know, capital flows without any condition in terms of following up, you know, who owns what, where, and then, you know, you end up in a situation where, you know, you have created a system where you can get rich in a country by using, you know, the public infrastructure of this country, and then you can push a button and send your wealth in any jurisdiction you want, and nothing has been planned to just keep track of where you are. And then you tell the rest of the population, oh, too bad, you know, I don't know where the wealth has gone, you know, there's nothing we can do, so we are going to have to tax you, you know, the immobile people. And then you are surprised that the immobile people are a bit upset with this kind of view of... so I think here something went completely wrong. And I think here we really have, you know, you cannot have free capital flow if you don't have, you know, some kind of common taxation to contribute to the public good. You know, that's just not possible. If you think of what, you know, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were proposing back in 2020, you know, remember, you know, the primary election for the Democratic Party, we sort of forget about it, but Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren got a huge majority of the vote among the young electorate. And when I say the young electorate, I'm not saying the students. You know, if you take people below 50, they had a huge margin against Biden. So, so, okay, it's important that people above 50 can vote, of course, but this is saying that, and what were they proposing? You know, they were proposing, together with a billionaire tax of up to 8% tax per year on top billionaire wealth, they had an exit tax of 40%, which means, okay, you can take your wealth out of the US if you want. You also have to give up your US passport, because in the US, unlike in Europe, you know, if you keep your passport, you keep the tax as well. So you can also give up your passport as well. You can take your wealth in another part of the world, but then you have to let 40% of the wealth at home with the Internal Revenue Service. Now, this is clearly a very different view of free capital flow, you know, that what we have constructed in Europe. So that's one of the issues on which there was a failure of social democratic thinking. You know, among the French socialists, you know, who negotiated the Maastricht Treaty with the German Christian Democrats, but also among the German Social Democrats. So, you know, at some point there was a social democratic majority everywhere in Europe, you know, at the end of the 1990s, but there was no plan of any sort of how to change this system. And we had to wait until the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID crisis to start thinking, okay, maybe, you know, all this tax haven and complete absence of transmission of information about cross-border assets, you know, maybe we need to do something. But, you know, social democratic party should have thought about it before. Anyway, you know, what matters is to find solution for the future, not to complain about this, but, you know, I think that's one of the areas. So you're questioning the existence of free capital flow if you don't have any counterpart in terms of redistribution, also in terms of sustainability. You know, we also have, of course, to question free trade, you know, with China, if you don't take into account the carbon content of what we import from China, you know. And, you know, look, what happened in recent years with China is completely crazy. You know, they destroyed democracy in front of us in Hong Kong, where they just shut down the electoral process, and all what we proposed in Europe was a new investment treaty to China. So, you know, I think here we have a big problem which, you know, needs to be confronted, and which, you know, involves not only social democratic parties, but in particular social democratic parties.
Thank you very much. We have 20 minutes left, and I would like to open the questions to the room. I see one hand up in the back. We have a microphone that's circulating, and we will collect questions. So there's one hand in the front, one in the back. I think we start in the back. There's lots of questions. We'll collect because many people would like to hear Thomas' answer. Please present yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much. My name is Verena Holz, and I want to ask, there was a plea today for new answers, and I wanted to ask Mr. Piketty what he thinks about the developments and in Europe towards a like 4 workday week or more like 30-hour work week. How much he thinks that this changes in society might also be important for more equality, especially more equality between the sexes.
Thank you very much. We'll come to the front with a microphone. Raise your hand if you feel that you should get it. There's one here, and then there's one on the other side. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Daniel Bache, and my question is, to what extent do you think does corporate property in the housing sector fuel social inequality, and do you advocate more collective property models?
Thank you very much. Thomas, you're taking notes. I'm taking a third question here on the side.
My name's Leah, and I would like to know, we talked a lot about the future and that more has to happen in the future. I would like to ask, what is the bliss point of equality? Is it total equality, or is there maybe a non-linear relationship between inequality and productivity?
Thank you very much. So, let's circle through the room. Thomas, you'll only get the concluding remarks because I have a lot of questions and you can pick. But let's go to the third line here. And I think if you hand them the mic, it's not going to come back, but you can go pass it from one to the other.
Thank you. My name is Eduardo Valencia. I just wanted to ask, there's been a lot of talk of the end of history and the rise of China, the war in Ukraine. And I was just wondering anybody's thoughts on the changing world order and what does that mean for equality?
Okay. Next to you are people who also want the mic. So.
Thank you very much. My name is Fabian Zubicki. And my question is on redistribution and crises. I think world history has been full of crises. And at the moment, I think we at least consider ourselves to be in one. And my question is a bit how crises and redistribution affect each other, especially now that military spending is going up and the state is committing to other forms of interests.
And just next, I saw another hand.
Hi, my name is Sinead. My question isn't so technical, but I'm wondering how optimistic you are about the trajectory of equality across our time.
So, Thomas, there's a lot of other hands up, but I'd like you to get room to breathe and at least pick already some answers, and then I'll circle around again if you can do so with in less than 15 minutes.
Well, let's try. Well, these are all, very interesting, important, and difficult questions, and I wish I was able to answer these, but let me take them one by one as clearly as I can. 30 hours per week, is this part of the solution to reduce inequality or to make better life in the future? Yes, definitely. I think the reduction of working time in the long run has been much larger than this, and it should continue. Now we have to be very careful about the speed and the organization in terms of distribution of working time in society, distribution of income that comes with this reduction. So in the case of France, when I think of the 35 hours per week law that was passed by the left in 1998, I think there were some problems, in particular for many people in low-skilled occupation. In fact, they got so much more flexibility in exchange that okay, maybe you have 35 hours per week, or in some case 30 or 25, but if you work as a cleaning lady 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours at night, and then you don't know what to do in the middle of the day to return home because you live very far, at the end of the day, the organization of the working time is even more important than the total number of hours and how much you get recognized for that. And so we need to be very careful about what it will mean and to create some status and some protection in terms of actual, working condition and organization of your work, so that this is indeed an improvement for everybody, and in particular for the, bottom 50% group of, whoever they are. So we have to be, so yes, this is part of the solution, but we have to be very careful about how we organize it. Corporate property in real estate sector, I'm not a big fan of this. I think we want to have individual owners. I believe in individual ownership. We also may want to develop, collective ownership with more sort of participatory governance involving, the people who live in the residence, or more generally, I very much believe in more sort of citizen control of corporations, whether in the real estate sector or any other sector. Third question was about the ideal level of equality, inequality. I'm not aiming for full equality. I think a salary scale or an income scale of 1 to 5, or some people would say 1 to 10 or 1 to 20. I think 1 to 5 or something like that is actually okay, or even maybe 1 to 3 in the long run. I don't know, but certainly, the empirical evidence, the comparative evidence I have is that 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 at the maximum is well enough for economic incentives and economic development. What is completely sure is that 1 to 50, 1 to 100, or 1 to 200, or this kind of enormous income scale, let alone wealth scale that we have today, is absolutely not useful for economic development. If I compare different historical periods, different societies, I just don't see any evidence for justifying this kind of extreme inequality level. Then there were some questions about the changing world order and the role of geopolitical crises and military spending. I think military spending is certainly not the best way to spend public money, and I understand the rationale for this, but I think in the case of what we do with Russia and I think we could be a lot more efficient in our economic sanctions and financial sanctions. If we have made some computation with some colleagues, with Gabriel Zuckman and other colleagues of mine about the extent of capital flight from Russia and how many billions of euros in Russian assets have been invested, in Paris, in London, in Courchevel and Côte d'Azur, and I'm sure in Germany as well. But France has been a place of choice for many Russian oligarchs, and we have done almost nothing about this. When you look at the numbers about the quantities of assets that have been frozen, we almost did not do anything. And the reason, I think, is that, some people may be afraid in the West. So, if you want, the Western oligarchs, or call them the Western billionaire, if you want, are afraid that if we really go after the Russian oligarchs or the Chinese oligarchs, then at the end of the day, this system of transparency about ownership and wealth, might also be turned against them. So here, I think there's a lot of hypocrisy in our attitude, and I think if we don't take stronger economic sanctions, especially about the top groups that have made their living and their power and their fortune out of the Putin regime or out of the Chinese regime today, if we don't target their economic assets, then we end up with military solutions which are far more costly in terms of destruction and all the consequences of everything that comes with the military. So I'm not saying we don't need any military, but I think we will need less military, and we will be in the end much more efficient by being more serious about the sanctions, and especially sanctions against the top people in each of these political regimes that we are talking about. There was also, the final question about, how optimistic I am I am optimistic in the long run, but, of course, sometimes the long run it takes a lot of time to get there. And so, I'm very concerned about what can happen in the short run or medium run. And I think in the end, the solution to the key problem we have to solve, I mentioned global warming in my presentation. The right solution will have to involve a reduction in inequality. Will have to involve, more equal economic power, political power. So I think we will get there, because, this will be the solution to, just like, in the 20th century, if you want economic growth and development, you need to invest in the education of everybody, and not just a little elite. Well, in the future, if we want to create the global warming challenge, if you want to create some social consensus about that, you will have to reduce inequality. But before we get there, we can have governments that are just trying to play national identities against national identities, to go into anti-migrant policies. This is what we have right now in Europe, in most European countries, and this is very sad. I think some people think in my country, in France, that in Italy or Sweden, that we have to try with these people in power before people understand that they are not going to solve the problem, just like Trump did not solve the problem in the US. But this is very costly to have this kind of experimental trajectory. So I hope we don't need to go through this experience. But I think in the end, even if these people get into power, they will not solve any of the problem we have to solve, and so we will have to move to something else. So yes, I am optimistic in the longer run.
Thank you very much, Thomas. We still have a couple of minutes to collect some more questions, possibly not all. I'll send the microphone back to the back of the room where there is a couple of hands, and maybe we can get all of these questions and then give a final round to both the panelists and Thomas as a conclusion.
Thank you. I'm Annalisa Wirth, and I'm wondering, you were addressing the issue with the data that you're working on to have a databases, and that it's actually a very time-consuming thing to do, and the necessity to analyze equality or inequality in that sense. Now, I think in Europe and a lot of other countries, we are fortunate enough to have these databases, while in a lot of countries of the global south, we do not, and there is no active way of currently pursuing to establish them. So how do you think we could still address issues of equality and inequality in those regions? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go towards this side. There were several hands up. Put them up so the microphone gets to you.
Thank you. My name is Noé, and I wanted to ask you if you believed climate change and global warming and then the slower economic growth that comes with it will exacerbate inequalities, or will it give populations kind of the momentum to ask for more redistribution? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We continue this way.
Hi, I'm Millie. In light of the fact that over the last 40 years or so, one of the drivers of increasing inequality has been to owners of capital, so real estate, stock market, etc. I was wondering what your thoughts are on the global monetary system, whether that's been at part to blame, and if so, is there anything that we can do to reform that? Thank you.
And the last question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Marie is my name. I would be interested, there is in Europe this movement of tax me now from billionaires, especially I think from the BASF Harris, who inherits part of the company. And I would be interested what you say about those, I wouldn't say grassroots movements, but these movements from millionaires and billionaires, also around the world, also in the US, as you mentioned, Bernie Sanders, to get taxed, especially say they want to be taxed by the state, they don't want to put their money in any philanthropical like work. Do you think this has a chance in the long run and move politics toward higher taxes? Yeah, that's basically it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since this is going to be the concluding round of remarks, Thomas, before I give the final microphone floor back to you, let me look at my panelists to see if they would like to pick up one or two of the topics that have been said here. If you want a final word on some of the questions or a remark, you can use this opportunity to speak. You will pass to Thomas. Okay, everybody would like to give you the floor. Let me just say on the availability of data question that I don't know if you realized that when you saw the data collection that Thomas presented in his first slides, he showed you a world map where every country has data points. And I don't know if you realize how truly exceptional that is. In most studies, when we present you with data on different countries, there's always some white spots in the middle. So I think even though there's a lot to be done still in looking for answers, and you're absolutely right in saying the data is much more lacking in the global south, and sometimes the data we have is of quality that makes us wonder whether we can actually pursue this. I still want to use it to commend the effort that you've been doing with all of these co-authors and workers in the data collection. But floor is to you for the last 5 minutes with all concluding remarks you'd now like to add, Thomas.
Thanks a lot, Cornelia. So following up on what you just said, indeed, we have made a lot of effort to have a better coverage of the global south in our database. Now, for many countries, it's very difficult because we don't have access to the right data we would like to have access to. But we made the following choice, which is both a statistical choice, but I would say even more so a political choice, to say, look, we are going to use whatever is available to distribute national income, to distribute national wealth, because, you government of Brazil, you government of India, if you pretend you are able to compute the GDP of your country, you should also be able to compute the distribution of GDP, the distribution of income and wealth. So we are going to use, whatever we have, we are going to make assumption based on, national accounts, household survey, tax data that you are willing to give us, Forbes billionaire data when we don't have anything else, although this is not a very good data source, but, we will do with what we have. We will be completely transparent about the limitation of the methodology, and then we will put pressure on you so that you release, more information, so that we improve, what we have in the database. And we would love to involve more, citizen movement, journalists. And, in many countries, this is how it worked. I remember in India, they had stopped publishing any income tax data, and it was through the help of activists and media people that we were able to put sufficient pressure on the government so that they had to release at least some data. In Brazil, we had a similar experience. So, this has to be a sort of collective citizen-based movement, asking for more transparency. This also has to come with a platform for, of course, some tax reform in the South, but also at the international level. So, I believe very much in the fact that, when we talked last year about the minimum tax on corporations, you remember there was this minimum tax of 15% for all multinationals. At least, this is maybe the beginning of something, but, what's missing is first, you need to have a good share of this tax revenue going to the South, which we don't have right now. This was a game between the North to divide between them the tax base that was in tax haven. We need to have some of these tax revenues that is directly targeted to countries in the South in proportion to their population and their exposure to climate change, because you cannot just beg every year to the countries in the North, please give me the money. This has, at some point, we'll have to move to some automatic formula based on the taxation of the most powerful economic actors in the planet. Which will involve multinationals. And point number two, this will also have to involve world billionaire at some point, because you cannot just be a billionaire, across the planet in your private jet, do space tourism, and give lessons to the rest of the planet about how to stop climate change. At some point, you will have to pay, and this is also a little bit, my answer, there was a question of, will the climate crisis, will it exacerbate inequality? Will it give a momentum to reduce inequality? I think in the long run, it should be and it will be a momentum to reduce inequality. Because, I think when climate catastrophe will get so terrible, people, the popular opinion about the economic system will change very quickly. So in particular, people will not find it funny anymore to see people taking their private jets and doing space tourism, and these kind of things. I think attitudes towards this have already started to change. In Europe, I can see people who track down the private jet on internet, and at some point, I think this would just be impossible to have this kind of living standards any longer. So I think it will be a momentum. I think someone asked about the Tax Me Now movement. Okay, I think it's good to have allies everywhere, and I think in the end, billionaires and children of billionaires, will be happier in a world where there are no billionaires any longer, and because I think in the end this is a burden, especially for the children of these people, and I think everybody will be in the long run more happy, in a more egalitarian environment. But in order to get there, I think we cannot count primarily, on convincing wealthy people and billionaires. If at the time of the French Revolution you wait for the nobility to accept the end of their privileges, I think this could not work. At some point, what's really key is to get a majority of the population that is convinced that there is another way to do this, and that this can be done, and at some point this will have to be imposed on including on those who disagree, in a democratic manner through the rule of law, everything you want, but it cannot. Taxation cannot be an individual voluntary decision. Otherwise there's no collective, there's no society, there's nothing that can work. And final question, which is very important. What about the responsibility of the monetary system in the rise of inequality and very large wealth? I think the problem is that we've been asking too much to the monetary system and not enough to direct redistribution through taxation and budgetary policy. And the reason is, take in the case of Europe, the European Central Bank is the only strong federal institution which can take a decision with just a majority of the vote. And this is why, we're asking the European Central Bank to solve all the problem, since 2008 financial crisis. And it's a little bit the same in the US, where the US Congress is often blocked and is unable to take decision about the budget and taxation. So we've been asking the Federal Reserve to print money and solve all the problems. The problem is that you cannot solve every problem just by printing money. And in some cases, printing money can actually exacerbate inequality because it creates real estate bubbles and stock market bubbles, which benefit those who have already a lot of wealth to invest, and it's not so good for people who want to enter the game. So this reflects an institutional problem, in particular in the case of Europe. And, this is why, and let me conclude with this, I've been very involved in the past in this manifesto for the democratization of Europe, which we discussed with Cornelia and Henrik. This brings us to the beginning. Last time we met in Paris, where, basically we make the following proposal. You will not be able to get rid of unanimity rule in Europe with the 27 countries anytime soon. So it's important to have a subgroup of countries, in particular involving Germany and France, but of course as many countries as possible that will accept to move to majority rule decision making for a number of budgetary and tax decisions, investing in the climate transition, investing in our universities. This could start, Germany and France created in 2019 a joint parliamentary assembly with members of the Bundestag, members of the French National Assembly, who meet in Strasbourg every year. Now it was created by a bilateral treaty between France and Germany, and the assembly is purely consultative. But it could be open to any country, Italy, Belgium, any country in the European Union who want to participate, and it could be granted real power in terms of having a common, carbon tax against imports from China which have too much carbon emission. It could be granted power to have an investment fund for new energy investment or in funding universities in Europe. So, that's the kind of idea that we've tried to push with this manifesto for the democratization of Europe. We have to demonstrate, probably with a smaller number of countries than 27 countries, that this can work. And then, hopefully all the 27 countries will join, and, even the United Kingdom will come back, and maybe Turkey and Ukraine, and I think, but you have to start with a smaller group of countries demonstrating that this can work. Otherwise, this will just never happen. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And thank you very much to Charlotte Bartels and Nikolaus for the discussion. This was really interesting. It's wonderful that you circled back to Franco-German solutions on our way forward. And of course, as always, Thomas has written an entire book of this. If you didn't get the reference, I'm happy to give it to you afterwards. Thomas, it was a real pleasure to listen to you. Thank you for tuning in. And for everybody who's in the room, unfortunately, we cannot have you with us, but now is the time to mingle and to walk outside these doors and have a glass and continue the discussion. But it was really wonderful to have you here, and thank you so much to our panelists and to Thomas.